The lack of ammunition and general equipment is the most obvious limit to the capabilities of the Bundeswehr right now. Restocking the arsenal would be the most effective investment in restoring these capabilities for multiple reasons. It gives the Bundeswehr the material it is supposed to have. It would send a strong signal to allies and others that Germany is serious about its stated commitments. It would build trust in the defense industry, and it can also be achieved on comparatively short timeframes depending on the type of ammo.
It's a machine gun! Machine gun!
Investing in ammunition would be quite simply the best bang for their buck that Germany has right now. So why aren't they doing it? Good question, glad you ask. It's an absolutely massive debate in the German defense community, so let me take you through it. The MOD had several talks with ammunition manufacturers dating back as far as the 28th of February in 2022, so a day after Scholz's 100 billion euro special fund speech. But since then there have not really been any orders for new ammunition, although this has recently now changed, as I will mention at the end of the video. The 100 billion euro fund was mainly funneled towards major systems acquisitions, F-35, heavy transport helicopters, frigates, clothing, satellites, APCs, drones, you name it. Of course, the value has now reduced to what is assumed to be roughly about 85 billion euros because of defense inflation, leading to some cuts in what is being bought. This is a juicy topic, of course, because if the Bundeswehr was to be equipped with the ammunition inventory required as per NATO guidelines, we are talking about an expense alone of around 20 billion euros for ammunition, which constitutes essentially a quarter of the money that has now been allocated in this special fund. Back then, of course, there was criticism that too much of the money was allocated to new purchases and that not enough was allocated to restocking the actual required stocks of the Bundeswehr and to ensure funds in the long run. There is more info on that in these videos right here. This is especially because the special fund would only top up defense spending for a few years, and defense spending itself was not really set to increase by itself. Although a final agreement, of course, on the financial plans is still outstanding. Well, it has now been approved, but later on in the video I'll go into that. While certain things are of course subject to change, during the making of this video the stated goals of the Ministry of Finance, German Ministry of Finance, do not really increase an defense spending budget until 2026. And that brings us to the ammunition, because if defense spending doesn't go up and the special fund in itself doesn't really allocate a lot of money towards ammunition, what are Hans and Franz going to use once they're out in the field? Now, in November 2022, the situation unraveled very quickly. First came a positive change as the Budgetary Committee of the German Parliament adjusted the spending provisions of the special fund that was being discussed. Now, this happened on the 11th of November. And also from a historical perspective, can we just silently acknowledge the irony of Germany adjusting defense spending or the special fund on that specific date? Yeah. Anyway, crucially for now, the Budgetary Committee of the Bundestag, so the German Parliament, upped the funds for ammunition by 1 billion euros, stretched over 2 years. As a side note, from a historical perspective, the lack of ammo is a common problem in all countries and conflicts, as this video from MHV explains. But of course there are cases where it's worse. Only a few days after this change by the Budgetary Committee, it became clear how little had been done on the questions of ammunition by the MOD. Arguably, the 14th November Q&As by the German government to questions of the opposition party kickstarted it all. In it, the government stated that it had met with ammunition manufacturers, but that the capacity expansion of privately organized companies follows business motivations aimed at obtaining future and sustainable orders. The MOD has no influence on investment decisions of the defense industry. Now, this does make sense. The government has no control over the manufacturers. Yet the statement, once contrasted to a follow-up question, appears less convincing. When asked whether the government has made contracts now or is working on contracts with manufacturers, it stated that there are currently no such plans. Thus, the government, by its own admission, has not signed or planned for any contracts with ammunition manufacturers at the date of this statement, so the 14th of November. Thus, they did not use the primary tool that gives companies reason to invest in their manufacturing capacities, a fact the government seems aware of, as they state themselves that these companies work and invest based on profit projections. Things then quickly snowballed. Within 2 weeks, the government had a meeting with the defense industry, another meeting with the defense industry, on the questions of ammo. And colloquially, this became known as the Munitionsgipfel or Ammunition Summit. This was a meeting on the bureaucratic level, so without members or ministers from the government actually present, and it seems to have had some results. Since then, certain things have trickled into the public and to what occurred during this meeting, and that is essentially that the defense industry explained some of the complexities of the situation, and let's narrow that down to a couple of things. First of all, that the delivery times might now be plus 2 years from now on, and that they do require certain guidelines and assurances from the government before they're actually going to start expanding and their capacities and start producing. And also a seeming reliance on Chinese imports, for example, cotton linters, which now have a delivery time of up to 9 months, was highlighted. And it appears as if the bureaucracy has now re-evaluated its well, just go on and produce without any contracts approach that it previously seemed to have had. But the big takeaway is really this. This meeting and the situation in general has prompted a discussion in Germany on some very basic questions. Who actually calls the shots? Who advises the ministry and the defense minister? And who provides coherency and a roadmap of how things should be done and by when they should be done? And what is noteworthy here too is that it's not only the current defense minister Christine Lambrecht who is under pressure, but there have been some serious questions and concerns raised about some of the higher ranking bureaucrats as well, who are of course part of this process. Fuel was added to the fire following this meeting when Defense Minister Christine Lambrecht turned around to Finance Minister Christian Lindner and asked for extra money for ammunition. The response was as long as it was spicy. It is our common concern to bring the Bundeswehr as quickly as possible up to a level that will enable it to perform its task fully and sustainably. This has already been taken into account in recent years through a steadily growing defense budget, and this year additionally through the provision of the special fund amounting to 100 billion euros. As you know, the MOD has every opportunity to use the funds according to its own technical prioritization as a specialist department. However, I note that you did not express the need for ammunition procurement mentioned here either during the negotiations on the special fund and its economic plan or in the course of the parliamentary procedure. In addition to the reliable identification and prioritization of individual projects in the area of equipment for the Bundeswehr, a continuous and sufficient concrete exchange of information with suppliers in the area of the defense industry also appears to me as crucial in order to create planning securities on both sides, as well as the use of acceleration possibilities within the procurement process, the rapid conclusion of decision-making processes, and the realistic and continuous monitoring of the development of funding requirements in defense procurement. And yes, the last paragraph was indeed a single sentence. Welcome to Deutschland. What's even more telling, however, is that the finance minister didn't reply himself, but his ministerial secretary did. Basically, that's the highest ranking bureaucrat in the Ministry of Finance. And he did not send the answer to the Ministry of Defense, so Christine Lambrecht, but to his counterpart in the Ministry of Defense. And if you are not familiar with sort of the political processes and protocol, that doesn't mean much. Don't worry about it. But if you are, well, basically the roof's on fire. And that brings us to the here and now. In a nutshell, it appears that the 100 billion special fund was announced. The German ministry went on a shopping spree to indicate the willingness to buy as many new systems as possible. Of course, this has to be signed off by the budgetary committee and the Bundestag, but essentially the statements of the intent were there to buy as many systems as possible without really first focusing their reinvestments into baseline capabilities and the stocks that the Bundeswehr is supposed to have. Over the past months, multiple instances of bad planning have also come to haunt them in PR fiascos, specifically regarding the conflict in Ukraine. One example is that the ammo supply for Gepards that were sent to Ukraine was arguably very low, and that the German government was having difficulties in procuring new rounds, although Switzerland blocking the export of this also really didn't help, so it's not just down to the German MOD. But then it also, for example, that when the Panzerhaubitze 2000 were sent to Ukraine, it transpired that Germany hadn't really set up any sort of system in order to procure new spare parts and stock up on those in order to provide replacement parts to Ukraine. And a recent report that has already been mentioned in the media but has yet to be published also indicates that the German army still struggles to meet their basic requirements. Now, those instances can be explained as a legacy of the previous decades. You can't really just flick a switch and just make things happen, even though on the internet sometimes we want things to happen that way, don't we? It's not how it's going to work. But in the ongoing situation since February 2022, it indicates that the MOD really struggles in these uncharted waters. And there are two elements of this. First, this is where the bureaucratic nature and perhaps, and I really cannot make a definitive statement on this because I don't know the people that are involved in this. But perhaps certain limits to the expertise of decision makers and bureaucrats do exist in this instance. And when these actors can then operate within bureaucratic processes that emphasize procedure over decision, they become a method of shifting away responsibility and hard calls rather than being a tool to implement change. The easy answer that now comes, I guess, to all of us, is just to call for reform. It has to be reformed. The problem is, of course, that during a period of reform, decisions and processes get pushed back even further, which is why some German defense experts say that the government should not take a hammer and start smashing up the bureaucracy and the procurement process, but rather it should provide clear guidelines, expectations, and promote initiative, while simultaneously, over a number of years, starting to lean out the process. And we have already seen some of this happen already. So for example, any expense of less than 25 million euros no longer has to pass the budgetary committee of the Bundestag, so the German parliament, for an extra check before a contract can actually be signed. Now that doesn't sound like much, but it is the beginning of something. And that brings me to the second point. The present situation calls for rapid changes and long-term planning at the same time, and that's not an easy combination. And you pair that with the fact that the Bundeswehr has been stripped bare for over a decade now. It will require massive investments to fulfill the baseline and then to modernize it. And both things are required. Right now, however, the MOD has focused almost exclusively on buying new stuff, new shiny stuff, emphasizing correctly, I might add, proven rather than in development equipment. But with that 100 billion euros available, well, 85 billion euros now, you can do a lot of things. And I believe that the most valid question should be, is it not more prudent to reserve a larger portion of the cake to refurbish the Bundeswehr in the short term, rebuild that capability that it should have? And while that is happening, you set up a National Defense and Security Committee. Well, things are in the work there. You develop a national security strategy, which Germany doesn't really have. And you do that preferably within a year or two. And then, based on that document and that vision, you start the long-term planning and procurement. And of course, while that is happening, there will be some exceptions in the margins. F-35, for example, could be one. Some of the ships, they require a lead time that is rather long, so there's something that needs to be invested in. And long-term investments like FCAS and MGCS, of course, as well. But no one would really fault Germany from buying only a few major platforms for now instead of a lot of new stuff, if they see that there is a clear drive to rebuild the present inventory of the Bundeswehr. Of course, now that the special fund has passed the budgetary committee of the German parliament last week, the first major acquisitions will start to commence, which means that in the coming months, I'll certainly have to make an update to this video. Let me know what you thought about all of that. Big thank you, of course, here to Andrew for the help on the script, and to all patrons and channel members for making this content possible. Check out the description below for all sources and helpful links if you, for example, want to support the channel. And as always, wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky. And also,